So next, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Spencer Cohen from High Peak Strategy. Spencer is a recognized expert on regional economic analysis, port economic impacts, U.S.-China trade and economic relations, China's economy, industry clusters, and international trade. He's also done quite a bit of work recently with our local cities and with the Washington Technology Industry Association. So please welcome our next speaker, Dr. Spencer Cohen.
Hi, Christina. Thank you, everyone. Good morning. It's been a real pleasure to present my perspective on the OneEastside region and talk about an economic outlook. So for today's talk, I'll be talking about U.S. and international trends over the past year and how those trends were shaken but are in the process of recovering. I'll also talk a bit about inflation, as that's a big issue of concern, as well as supply chain disruptions and the connection between the two. Then we'll go deep into OneEastside economic performance and trends and outlook over time, and talk about economic recovery, and really to that theme about the sort of a tale of two recoveries. So what have been the impacts on the pandemic for different types of constituents and businesses and communities? So firstly, just looking nationally and internationally, we know that in 2020 was a very difficult year for the globe. Global economy contracted by about 3.1%. China was the only major economy in the world that actually experienced anything in positive territory for growth. In 2021 was a big rebound year, so China grew by 8.1%. The US economy grew by about 5.7%, and is expecting in 2022 to grow at about 4%, largely recovering a lot of that lost economic output during the pandemic. China is going to continue to approach or surpass the US as the largest economy in the world. That will likely happen around 2030. The US is roughly, give or take, around 23% of global economic output, and that'll continue until about 2030 or so. We also saw the trade. The Eastside region is one of the most trade-reliant regions of the country. And so we saw a huge disruption in trade. And that's happened across the globe. We saw a huge drop in trade of goods and services and exports and imports of commodities during the recession, but then a rapid recovery afterwards. And that's really had a really disruptive effect on our logistics system and supply chains, which we'll talk about. The U.S. economy is in a period of extended recovery from the last recession. So the recession, the non-farm employment had increased 113 consecutive months since September of 2010. That, of course, ended with the pandemic. That was a historic high going back to when data was collected going back to 1939. The most recent recession that we're coming out of, we've seen about 10 months or 12 months now of continuous non-farm employment growth, and there's little suggest that might change in the next few cycles as well. Unemployment has fallen from a peak of about 15% down to about 4%. But really, unemployment is really, if you unpack employment, there's a lot of difference in different groups based on educational attainment level as well as race and ethnicity across the country. We saw, for instance, that people with bachelor's degrees or higher, which is very common within the OneEastside region, it's one of the most educated parts of the country, the unemployment rate among that cohort of workers in the labor market was only 2.3% as of the end of 2021. That compares with about 4.6% with people who don't have anything higher than a high school diploma. That difference in employment also applies to race and ethnicity. You can see, for instance, that African Americans had experienced much higher unemployment nationally going back to the Great Recession, and prior to that, there was some convergence in unemployment nationally up until the pandemic. Unfortunately, that divergence has begun to expand again during the recovery period. See that people, whites and Asians, had experienced unemployment roughly around 3.4 to 3.6%, whereas African Americans are close to 7%. So inflation is obviously a really big concern, and it's something that has been really rattling markets and has raised a lot of really worries about the long-term impacts of inflation. For those that are old enough to remember the inflation of the 1980s or late 70s, early 80s, and the disruptive impact that had on the economy. There are really a couple different ways to measure inflation. There's what's called consumer price index, which is one measure based on survey of consumers or households and what they're paying. And then there's what's called personal consumption expenditures, which is a survey of businesses and what prices they're charging. And then the Federal Reserve, their preferred measure is what's called core PCE, which is personal consumption expenditure, but netting out food and energy, which are typically much more volatile. But across all measures, we've seen historic high increases in inflation. The 7.1% CPI in the last month of 2021 was, or actually in January of 2022, was the highest since the early 1980s. And that actually applies across all three types of measures. And this really erodes people's consumption power, ability, their household consumption, and raises the augur that the Federal Reserve will raise interest rates, which would dampen growth and dampen the recovery potentially. Within the Seattle region, consumer price index, after being at a low 0.9% year over year in late 2020, has surged upwards of 7.6% in 2021, at the end of 2021. So there are a lot of reasons why inflation is happening. The two main reasons have to do with a tight labor market as well as with supply chains. The tight labor market, we saw that there was a significant reduction in labor force participation, so a reduction in the labor force during the recession, and then that's only begun to trickle back. We saw, for instance, that a lot of workers left those low-wage jobs, and that resulted in seasonally adjusted wages growing at 5% year over year in the last quarter of 2021. And the median wage in January increased about the same, about 5.1%. That's the largest increase since 2002. The other factor, of course, is COVID impacts on supply chains. So we've seen, many of us have experienced empty, barren shelves at supermarkets and other kinds of stores, delayed deliveries of products on Amazon. And that was caused by factory closures from sick workers, both domestically as well as overseas, especially in places in Asia. And then shifting consumption patterns as more and more people opted to buy physical goods through e-commerce as opposed to spending on services. And that really created a lot of stress on the supply chain and logistics systems. And even small components, such as the semiconductor, if they're unavailable, such as in the vehicle market, in the vehicle industry, can have a really an outsized impact on prices. The other factors include excess liquidity, with the Federal Reserve outlays for about $3.6 trillion in actual stimulus based on $5 trillion in the last 2 years. But that really made up for lost wages. It wasn't additive for the most part on top of people already. There were some additive components, but it really wasn't. It was in lieu of lost wages for the most part. So the most recent estimates by San Francisco Fed estimate that in 2022, the Fed stimulus, especially the last round stimulus, the $1.9 trillion in 2021, will only contribute about 0.3 percentage points to inflation in 2022. Tariffs, of course, also create a cost to households. The punitive tariffs that were enacted in 2018 through 2019 by the Trump administration certainly affect household consumption and the cost borne by households, but there's a timing mismatch, so it doesn't really explain the most recent increase in inflation. You can see labor force participation, as I mentioned, fell in 2020, fell from 63% of working age adults down to 60%, and it's only gradually recovered. That has really helped to drive wages because of a constrained labor market. You have a high demand for workers, but you have or even consistent demand, but then reduction in availability or supply of workers. We've also seen the supply chain system has really been disrupted. The backlog at LA Long Beach, which is the largest port system in the country, had experienced an historic high in 2020 with more than 100 vessels. We all saw the pictures on the news of vessels waiting adrift or anchor. 77% of ports globally experience some degree of backlog in abnormally long times for turnaround of container traffic. And roughly about 98% of warehouses in the Southern California's logistics-heavy Inland Empire were basically at full occupancy. So all this was really happening on top of a very fragile system in place already, where we had limited supply and shortage even of truck drivers and just-in-time logistics. So there was a very sort of delicate balance that was already in place before the pandemic that really created a lot of stress and disruptions and delays in the supply chain. Another measure we also saw was that retailers as well, also during the pandemic, drew down their inventories and are now only now building those inventories up. And that's what that dotted line represents. It's the ratio of retailer inventory to sales or advanced sales. And when that approaches one, that really indicates that there's going to be a shortage availability. And that's what indeed happened. A lot of people also shift consumption to e-commerce, which is more physical goods. So people during the pandemic opted to purchase, instead of purchasing services, going out to eat, where buying more of their consumption was steering more towards buying of physical goods on e-commerce. And that had the effect also of increasing a lot of stress on the ports. And then lastly, people really increased their savings early on in the pandemic and are now drawing down that savings. We saw a really significant increase in personal savings rates during the recession, and now people are drawing that down and spending that savings, especially on physical goods, adding more stress. And this really affects the Pacific Northwest, especially the One Eastside region, because so many of our businesses here are import intensive. They really depend on the availability of imported components and goods in their manufacturing process. And that's particularly true with aerospace, with food and beverage processing, and other kinds of various kinds of advanced manufacturing that really can be a drag on growth. So now I'm going to go deep a little bit on the One Eastside, 23 city One Eastside region and talk a bit about what really makes this region unique. Of course, it's a hub first and foremost of global companies, whether it's Costco, it's got new operations for Amazon, Microsoft, T-Mobile, Boeing, Blue Origin. It's a really unique ecosystem of highly advanced companies and businesses that are multinational and globally renowned. The Eastside region is among the most educated, diverse, and high income earning in the United States. Roughly about 37% of households on the East Side earn at least $150,000 a year. That's essentially, that's more than double the rate for Washington State and for the US. 60% of residents on the East Side have at least a bachelor's degree. That compares with only 36% in Washington State and 32% in the US. And then the East Side is incredibly diverse. Roughly about 20% of all residents on the East Side were foreign born. And of those, 10% entered the US no earlier than 2010. 18% of all East Side residents actually immigrated from Asia, compared with just 6% for the US. East Side is also a big hub for educational institutions. You can see there are roughly about 30,000 students that were enrolled in East Side higher education programs in 2021-22, such as Bellevue College, UW Bothell, Renton Technical College, and so forth. And you can see East Side, roughly 27% of East Side residents identify as Asian. That compares against just 11% in Seattle and about 7% in the US. So one of the really great stories about the East Side is that despite all of the disruption and the pain that's been experienced across the country during the pandemic and all the job loss, the East Side actually had job growth during the most recent recession during the pandemic. And that's really because of the tech sector. The tech sector has been the main driver of that growth. In 2020, the Seattle metropolitan area, which includes King and Snohomish counties, had a net loss of 100,000 jobs. The East Side region, those 23 cities, actually experienced a gain of 4,000 net jobs. Now, that's really true because of the tech sector and the growth that's happened in the tech sector, but that doesn't mean that everybody experienced had a positive experience during the pandemic, of course. And we saw in the East Side that there were severe impacts felt, especially for a combination of food services, a loss of 1,600 jobs, and also the fact that all of the loss of remote workers or people working remotely as opposed to on-site really adversely impacted a lot of the businesses that serve that daytime traffic. So lots of restaurants, other kinds of services that serve the daytime commuter community and workers has been a big impact, as well as personal services, beauty salons, fitness centers, and so forth. There were roughly about 492,700 jobs on the East Side. In 2021, that was an increase over 484,200 jobs. The biggest component was services, which is really a wide category to include both, typically personal services, restaurants, a combination, but then also high-tech workers, software publishing, other kinds of tech activities. So as I mentioned, the tech sector has really been a big driver, and these are statewide numbers for 2019 and 2020. And again, what's really astonishing is that the tech sector, despite the fact Washington State statewide 2019 to 2020 actually lost close to 200,000 jobs, 180,900 jobs were lost statewide, at least on a temporary basis in 2020. The tech sector actually added 20,300 jobs in that same period. So Washington State employment contracted by about 5.3%. The tech sector actually grew by 8%. And so many of those tech sector jobs were in the East Side, and they're playing a big role. Those tech sector jobs really drive additional economic growth in the region because of the high wages those workers earn, the spending of that household, that income on various kinds of household consumption. We saw that, and that really kind of tells that story that Christine was referring to about the tale of two recoveries. The tech sector did really well, but all of the businesses, such as restaurants that cater to the tech sector and those tech workers, really suffered because they were not available. Those workers were not present. They were working remotely and not spending income, for instance, at their location where they would work typically. Tech is also continue to drive growth. We saw, for instance, most recently that there's been 14 new mega leases in the region that actually propelled the tech sector, our region, past the Bay Area for the most new tech office space in 2020. If you compare the East Side to other major tech hubs across the country, in this case, Austin, the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, Denver, and Atlanta, the tech sector, or the East Side economy between 2009 2019 was kind of middle of the pack, grew about 2.2% per year. But between 2019 and 2021, it far exceeded everybody else in all these other regions in terms of job growth. The OneEastside region grew about 1.3% per year over the last 2 years. Every other major tech hub, with the exception of Austin, actually contracted in employment over that period, with Austin growing about 1.1%. You can also, the small businesses are also an integral part of the East Side economy. They're roughly about 72.5, 73% of all businesses, or work sites is what we call them, which are a rough approximation of businesses on the East Side were of businesses of 10 or fewer employees. Nearly 1,700 business locations had to temporarily or permanently shutter in 2020, and the vast majority of those businesses were these small businesses of 10 employees or less. 11% of workers on the East Side were working at these businesses. So these businesses really felt the brunt of the recession and really brunt of a lot of required closures, temporary closures, social distancing, and so forth. Unemployment rate, the East Side is only at about 2.9%. That's well below Washington State and the US, which are at 3.9 or 4.5 and 3.9%. So again, really showing the resiliency, in large part, again, because a lot of these workers are highly educated workers in very resilient industries, such as the tech sector on the East Side. Now, one of the other really telling stories about the East Side has been population growth. We hear a lot about Seattle as a major hub for growth and population, bigger increases in population. But if you look at the numbers, in fact, since 2000, the East Side cities combined have grown more than twice as fast as Washington State and compared to Seattle. There are about 749,700 residents on the East Side in 2021. That would actually make the East Side bigger than Seattle if the East Side was its own city. Since 2010, the East Side has added in net 186,000 new residents, or that's roughly about 18% of all new net residents across the entire state. Of course, this also creates a lot of pressure on the housing market. I'm sure many of us experienced the difficulties if you were looking for a home over the past several years. East Side is becoming increasingly unaffordable, especially for these services-based workers, those that were most directly adversely impacted by the pandemic, who work in the East Side but might not actually live in the East Side, but would like to be closer to their place of employment. Since 2012, the cost per square foot residential floor space has increased over 200% across many of the cities in the East Side, including Bellevue, Kirkland, Bothell, and Sammamish. And so every community, even rural areas, are experiencing rapid price increases. And some cities, in fact, are more expensive than Seattle, such as Bellevue and Kirkland. So I'll take the last part of this discussion, really talk about economic recovery and outlook, and what are the main considerations that we want to think about when we think about economic recovery, and what are the real limitations or inhibiting factors you might want to also consider in the next roughly about 5 to 10 years. So firstly, economic recovery, we project, High Peak Strategy project that there will be an increase of about 40,000 jobs between 2021 and 2025 in the Eastside region. That's largely driven by organic growth, and what we're seeing in terms of that's driven by population growth, it's driven by many new businesses opening, but it's also driven by a lot of new new office investments and investments by companies such as Amazon, by Meta, which is what used to be called Facebook, by other companies, as well as the expansion of the Microsoft and opening of the Microsoft campus, reopening the campus. That's going to help drive growth. A big wild card in that, of course, is what's going to happen with respect to remote work. So if a lot of workers, for instance, a lot of businesses decide that they're going to move to a hybrid model of employment, where their workers might only go to the office 3 or 4, maybe 2 to 3 days a week, and then work remotely somewhere else, that could also be that could weigh down growth, because so many businesses, as I mentioned before, especially minority-owned and ethnic-owned businesses, are really relying on or really catered to a lot of those workers and serving them, providing accommodation services, restaurant services, other kinds of retail services. The loss of that daily foot traffic could really be a challenge for those businesses, at least partially, especially if those employers decide not to have their workers there every day or allow them to work remotely at least part of the week. But for now, at least, we project about a 40,000 job increase. Population should increase from about 749,700 residents and to roughly about 770,000 residents by 2025. So, as I mentioned, tech sector has led the way, and this really gets again to that narrative around a tale of two recoveries. The tech sector has really been driving growth, but small businesses have really struggled. I had the opportunity to work on a project recently for the city of Redmond that looked at the impact of the pandemic on small businesses, including minority ethnic-owned businesses, and really understand a lot of the challenges those businesses are facing, and a lot of the lack of connectivity between federal programs or alignment of federal programs and local economic development programs and the needs of those businesses. And so there is a lot to be disentangled with those programs, and helping to find ways to support businesses, to provide the proper mentorship that's available, and also to build connectivity from a cultural and linguistic standpoint as well. Remote work will hurt a lot of businesses. Most companies are planning resumption of on-site work as soon as Omicron fades. I believe Microsoft will be going back to in-office work very soon as well. It's part of that. But again, that hybrid model could be very disruptive to the economic recovery of many of these businesses, these small businesses. So again, looking at the PPP loans, or the Payroll Protection Program loans, you get a sense for who was really impacted by the pandemic again, and who was less impacted or a little more resilient. Micro businesses, those are businesses of 5 employees or less, received about 2/3 of all the loans on the East Side between 2020 and 2021, about 14% by value. So these are the businesses that were most adversely impacted, that really needed help, that really were suffering because of the lack of foot traffic and customers throughout the pandemic. Whereas those with 100 employees or more received about 1/4 of the loans and grants, but represented about 1.4% of all the actual loans that were going out, but roughly 26% by value of those loans. You can see too that full service restaurants, as expected, were the most directly impacted. And this is just looking at PPP loans and grants as a proxy for the impacts of the pandemic. They received about over 1,079 loans and grants over the past 2 years from the federal government, or about $205 million. And these are businesses that averaged about 22 employees per operation. And you can go down a list of other, whether it's beauty salons, other kinds of professional technology services, many small businesses, all of them small businesses that averaged about 10 workers per business, were the main recipients of these loans by number of loans. a lot of the recovery, looking forward, the tech sector, again, is really going to be the driver of new office space. And that's really what's been factoring into our forecast for jobs in the region, is a lot of it, driven by both the organic growth of the tech sector, but also the announcements and new growth, new operations, new activities, new office space usage by the tech sector on the east side. Within the Bellevue Central Business District, there's projected to be about 1.5 million square feet of office space for absorption in 2022. Amazon has announced a 6 million square feet in Bellevue and plans to add 25,000 jobs over the next few years in Bellevue. Microsoft is set to complete their multi-million dollar, multi-square foot expansion at its resident campus in Redmond by 2023. And that'll be in time for light rail. And that is going to add, in addition to the existing Microsoft footprint, will add many more jobs in addition with the expansion. And then Meta, as I mentioned, also known as Facebook, has committed to occupying more than 1.4 million square feet of space by 2024. So the things that are most pressing that we're thinking about, and we're thinking about resilience, and we're thinking about recovery. So as I mentioned before, the return of on-site office work is a big concern. It could go either way, and what impact that'll have on the local economic recovery. Consumption patterns may not return to pre-pandemic levels. It's possible, and we've seen that while e-commerce sales were already moving an upward trajectory before the pandemic, there was a very sudden increase in e-commerce sales. And that's likely to stay as people become increasingly comfortable with ordering a larger share of their basket of goods through e-commerce platforms and not going to stores as much. That could affect a lot of the retail sector on the east side. That also really affects the arts and culture sector, because there's a lot of new technologies that consumers want and how they consume arts and culture, whether it's music, whether it's other forms of entertainment. That is really going to challenge the arts and culture sector, which is really an integral part of our community. And that could also have an adverse impact. And these are businesses and nonprofits that were also severely impacted by the pandemic, because so much of their delivery of their service is delivered in person, and that's going to be a challenge. So these organizations will be challenged to think about ways to leverage new technology to deliver at least part of what they do to their consumer base or their constituent base. Inflation is projected to get under control through the first half of the year. There's a lot of obviously uncertainties. The unfortunate crisis in Ukraine right now is most likely going to be affecting oil prices and energy prices. The U.S. is much less dependent on foreign oil and foreign energy sources as it was during the OPEC embargo era in the 70s. Nonetheless, these are global commodities. We are still affected by them nonetheless, even if we're not purchasing directly from Russia, for instance. So that's going to have an impact likely that we could see, and that could really continue to disrupt inflation and prop up inflation as well. And there's other global developments, changes in supply chains, fissures in trade in the U.S.-China relationship could also affect a lot of businesses in the OneEastside region, especially given how important China is as a trade partner to Washington State, as well as especially a critical market for tech companies that are based on the east side. And then affordability. The affordability challenges are quite real. As I mentioned, there is a large misalignment between a lot of workers in the services sector that work in the east side, but find it much more difficult to be able to buy homes on the east side. And that's only seemingly going to get worse and worse, given the continued growth of many of our leading sectors and growth of the regional overall population. It's going to make it much more prohibitively expensive in many cases for many of our residents to be able to afford to live on the east side. And that will be another big challenge. And then lastly, of course, we don't know if there'll be another variant, or there'll be much more what that variant would be and what impact that variant of COVID will have on mask wearing or on our other kind of public policies, and what impact that will have on local and on the economy, and disruptions to retail and disruptions to consumption in the future. So with that, I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to share my thoughts today. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at my email at spencer@highpeakstrategy.com. And thanks again for the opportunity to share my thoughts.